Hi, this is Bighara, and this is my video blog about tabletop role-playing and role-playing games, especially old-school style games like classic Dungeons & Dragons and retro clones. Today I was going to talk a little bit about settings, specifically about the classic Dungeons & Dragons style fantasy setting, regardless of whether you're playing it with D&D or another system. By a classic setting, I'm referring to what some people call a traditional fantasy setting. This is something which usually has like a Western European motif or style or tone to it. You have castles, you have knights, you have people with swords and shields and armor and wizards and things like that. And then you also have the classic fantasy elements like elves and dwarves and things like that, generally often referred to as something similar to Tolkien from Lord of the Rings kinds of races, orcs, that sort of thing. And then, of course, dragons, those kinds of monsters. What you have is a lot of people who have played these kinds of games, often for years, various editions, various systems, and you hear frequently people discussing settings and talking about the idea that that kind of a classic or traditional fantasy setting has been done, and they're over it, or they're a little tired of it and want to switch things up or try something different. Either changing up the setting, maybe doing like an Asian kind of a setting, or something just really out there, or a different kind of genre with the setting. Instead of doing your swords and sorcery fantasy type game in that kind of setting, maybe they want to do something like horror, kind of like Cthulhu Dark Ages or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay or something like that. Or perhaps they want to mix genres. They want to have a sort of sci-fi and fantasy thing, like a Sword and Planet kind of game, John Carter of Mars, that sort of thing. And all that's really cool, and don't get me wrong, I love that kind of stuff. But what I was going to talk about today was the idea that the traditional fantasy setting is being boring or plain old vanilla kind of a backdrop, and with very little, to make it interesting. And people like looking for gimmick settings, where the whole point is there's some sort of gimmick to the setting. It's just like D&D, but the elves are robots. Whatever. I think it's probably giving short shrift to the traditional setting to say that it's boring or been done, and there's it's old news or whatever. Because I think there's an advantage to the traditional setting in some games. It's not every game, obviously. Play what's fun, and switching things up is fun. I do it all the time. But the advantage to the traditional setting is its familiarity, I think, or at least it's one of them. The idea that a person can sit down at the table, they've probably some point in their lives, if they've been gaming and playing D&D and things like that for a while, they've probably played in a Greyhawk game, or a known world Mystara type game, or Forgotten Realms, or what have you, and they're familiar with these ideas. This is what a halfling's like. This is what an orc is. This is what a dragon's like, and so forth. And so they've got a sense of what the world around their character is like, and that gives them a chance to kind of immerse themselves a bit in it and feel a little more comfortable playing the game. So they're not referring back to the setting information, trying to remember, whatever gimmick or gimmicks that make the setting different, and how they apply, because they've never played a game with robot elves or whatever it is before. And once you have players getting more immersed in their characters and their characters' surroundings, you can have what I like to call a player-driven game. And that's something where the DM, instead of having to put the adventure out on the table and say, okay guys, here's the adventure, what do you do? The players are coming up with their own ideas, and they're saying, hey, we wanted to go back to that town, and we wanted to talk to that watch captain, because we think he might know something. Or maybe they're coming up with their own schemes, like they want to start their own caravan guard service, or they want to open a tavern, or whatever it is. But the point is, regardless of whether it's something more adventuresome or more normal or mundane. The players are getting interested in what's going on, and they're trying to make things happen. And if they're deciding what they want to happen or to what they want to try and do, you've got their interest. They already are invested in the game. Because they wanted to do that. It wasn't that you said, today we're going to go kill a bunch of kobolds, and they didn't have to sit there and go, oh man, kobolds, or whatever. But it's not that that can't happen in a gimmick game. It's not that that can't happen in an unusual setting. But you're one step closer if the players are already familiar with the setting and the genre, regardless of whether it's a different fantasy world or not. But there's a reason a lot of people will continue to play a particular setting, like Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms or Mystara or whatever, for a long time, because everybody knows it. Now, obviously, the drawback to that is the idea that maybe some of the secrets have already been exposed, and in a new campaign where your character wouldn't know about it, the player remembers that, oh, that kind of troll is immune to fire. You got to throw sand in its eyes. Whatever the heck it is. Another gimmick. Yeah. So anyway, it gives you a chance to build on something where you already have a level of investment in the setting, and also the fact that it's not just the players that can build something on that. You can take something that's, for all intents and purposes, a fairly traditional setting, and you can make all sorts of interesting things happen within that framework, just using it as a frame or a springboard. One of my favorite traditional fantasy published settings is the known world, also known later as Mystara, which was put out for Basic Expert and Basic Expert Companion Masters, Rules Cyclopedia, and all those. And the first book they put out in the Gazetteer line was the one for the Grand Duchy of Karameikos. I highly recommend getting a copy of this if you can manage it. It's a crying shame that Wizards of the Coast pulled those PDFs off the legal download sites like RPG Now and stuff like that, along with a bunch of their other stuff. I was fortunate enough to have purchased the download years ago when it was still available. And it didn't get pricey on eBay. But if you can get a hold of one, it's great. It's my favorite one of the Gazetteer series, of which they did like 14. And for all, intents and purposes, it's a pretty traditional fantasy setting. You have a population of elves. It's mostly humans. You've got orcs and bugbears over here. You've got dwarves and gnomes over there. There's halflings that live around this area. It's all very, very by the book on a certain level. But within that are a lot of little things that can make it very interesting. This includes political tension between the indigenous population and the ruling population, which is actually colonized from another nation. There's a treacherous noble a baron who's causing all sorts of trouble, and his cohort wizard is a schemer and the classic, evil vizier type wizard magic user, Bargle, which some people might remember that name. There are religious churches and temples that are having religious schisms and rivalries about the nature of religion in the country. There's all kinds of stuff like that. And then on top of that, you have all the typical monsters and races and things like that are going on. But none of it is really any different than what you would find just if you picked up a copy of the Dungeons and Dragons rules or one of the Retroclone rules and looked at how they depict things like spells and classes and races, like dwarves and elves and so forth. They're all pretty much by the book, but it's a very three-dimensional living, breathing place. And that's not even a whole huge series of books. That's just one installment, 60 or 100 pages or so, and that's with a whole lot of stuff that if you were just running your own game you wouldn't need. So I think my point here, I've made, is that if you're looking to run a Dungeons & Dragons style game and you're thinking about a setting, regardless of whether it's published or not, before you chuck the traditional vanilla fantasy setting out the door and try to come up with some sort of gimmick to make it interesting, take another look at it and think about how you might use the things that players are familiar with to help them build momentum in the game, have them being driving events somewhat because they feel like they're on more familiar ground, and how you can add depth to things without necessarily totally changing around how people are or how the world is or anything like that. And you might just be surprised. And you can get a lot of fun out of a very typical setting like that with not a lot of extra work, and end up with a campaign, that people might still be talking about years after it's over, or might run for years. Take it easy, because I got to answer the phone.